The mouse will quit within a week. That is what Dr. Marcus Whitfield said to the two surgical residents 17 minutes before he made the bet that would cost him everything. Danielle Ross did not hear him. She was already 3 floors below, moving through the pharmacy corridor of St. Michael's Hospital in Philadelphia with the kind of deliberate invisibility that comes from 20 years of practice, 20 years of being looked at and never quite seen. The fluorescent lights hummed their surgical frequency overhead, that steady 60 Hz drone that sounds like the world holding its breath. Her name tag read D. Ross, RN, night shift in letters small enough that most people didn't bother reading it at all. The hospital after midnight was a different creature than it was during the day. The hallways belonged to the ones who moved quietly. The ones who understood that hospitals were not places of recovery so much as places where time moved differently, where minutes could stretch into hours and hours could collapse into moments. Danielle's footsteps made no sound on the linoleum. She had trained herself out of the habit of footsteps years ago, back when footsteps meant something, back when the wrong sound at the wrong moment could cost lives. The habit had stuck. It was useful now, in ways she did not like to think about. Her shift began at 11 p.m., and by 11:19 she had already checked on 6 patients in the intermediate care unit, verified medication administration records for 4 more, and noticed that someone had ordered $17,000 worth of surgical suction equipment that St. Michael's had ordered just 3 months prior. She knew this because she actually read the supply requisitions. Most night nurses didn't. The inventory logs were technical documents that existed in that gray space between paperwork and irrelevance. Danielle found them fascinating in the way that soldiers find ballistics reports fascinating, as stories told in numbers and dates and vendor codes. The supply closet on the 3rd floor was narrow and hummed with the sound of the automated medication dispenser in the corner. The air inside tasted like plastic and disinfectant. Danielle closed the door behind her and stood in the dimness for a moment, just breathing, just existing in a space where no one could see her. From the left pocket of her scrubs, the one beneath the fold of her long-sleeved undershirt, beneath the layers of fabric she kept between her scarred forearms and the world, she withdrew the challenge coin. It was small enough to fit in her palm, tarnished enough that the relief had almost worn smooth from 30 years of hands turning it over and over. The emblem on one side was barely visible now, an eagle with wings spread wide enough to block out the sky, and beneath it, a single word, Fallujah. The coin had been pressed into her hands by a captain named Sarah Chen on a day in 2004 when the Jolin district was burning and a child with her lower leg nearly severed had been screaming for her mother. Danielle had not known then that the 8-year-old girl in her arms would grow up to command one of the Navy's most decorated strike teams. She had only known that the bleeding had to stop and the fear had to go somewhere other than into her own hands, so she had locked it away. 20 years of locking away. 20 years of this coin sitting in the bottom drawer of her apartment, and then in her pocket the night she had decided to take a night shift job at a hospital where no one would know her, where she could be small and quiet and useful in ways that no one would question. She turned the coin over 3 times. Once for the girl in Fallujah. Once for the 16 other Marines who did not make it out of that firefight. Once for herself, for the part of her that had learned to move through the world like a ghost because being visible was a luxury that ghosts did not need to afford. The trembling was not fear. The trembling was information. The trembling was her body telling her that she was still here, still alive, still capable of handling things that would shatter most people into pieces. She breathed until the trembling stopped. Then she returned the coin to its pocket and stepped back out into the hallway. On the 4th floor, in his office overlooking the city, Dr. Marcus Whitfield sat at a mahogany desk that cost more than most people's cars and reviewed the quarterly budget reports with the satisfaction of a man who had engineered his own prosperity with the kind of precision that resembled nothing so much as a perfectly executed con. He had been the chief of surgery at St. Michael's for 11 years. Before that, he had worked at 3 other hospitals, each one a stepping stone to the next, each one a place where the surgical supply contracts flowed through his preferred vendors, companies that paid kickbacks in the form of consulting fees and conference registrations and summer homes in the Poconos. $17 million over a decade. It was almost embarrassing how easy it had been. Almost embarrassing until 3 weeks ago, when a new night shift nurse had started double-checking the inventory logs. He had noticed her first in the corridors, a thin woman with grey-streaked hair pulled back into a severe knot, long sleeves despite the heat of the summer, the kind of face that suggested she had seen things that had worn away the softness. She moved with unusual efficiency. She did not chat with the other nurses. She did not ask about her co-workers' families or weekend plans. She simply worked, with an attention to detail that suggested either compulsive neurosis or military training. Whitfield was betting on both. On Tuesday of her first week, she had questioned an order for additional CARM fluoroscopy equipment. On Wednesday, she had asked why the hospital had suddenly needed 3 new ultrasound machines when the existing ones were barely 3 years old. On Thursday, she had flagged an order for surgical suction canisters that was identical to the one placed 90 days prior. By Friday, Whitfield had pulled her personnel file and found very little of interest, references from previous employers that were suspiciously vague, a nursing license that checked out, a background that was somehow simultaneously comprehensive and completely empty. It was the emptiness that worried him most. "Get me a full background check," he had told his administrative assistant, a woman named Linda who had worked for him long enough to understand that some requests did not come with paperwork. "And find out where she came from before this. I want addresses, employers, anything you can locate." Linda had returned the following Monday with a puzzled expression and a single file. "It's odd," she said, placing it on his desk. "Her nursing credentials are clean, her references all check out, but there's almost nothing before 2010. It's like she didn't exist before that." Whitfield had dismissed her concern with a wave of his hand, but the question had settled into his mind like a stone in still water: who was this woman, and why had she started caring about the inventory logs? The answer, he suspected, was that she was a problem. She appeared in the supply room at 1:19 a.m. on her shift, moving between the shelves with the systematic precision of someone cataloging a library. She was checking the dates on sterile packaging, cross-referencing them against the purchase orders, her lips moving slightly as she counted. Whitfield watched from the doorway for 3 minutes before she noticed him. When she did not startle. She simply turned, with the smooth, unhurried motion of someone who had turned in response to threats many times before, and inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. "Dr. Whitfield," she said. Her voice was low and even. "I was just verifying the inventory against the quarterly requisitions." "Yes," he said, stepping fully into the room. "I've noticed." He moved past her, close enough that he could see the edge of what looked like scar tissue running beneath the cuff of her sleeve, thick, surgical-looking, the kind of scar that suggested trauma and survival. "Tell me, Ms. Ross, in your previous nursing positions, did you always take such a proprietary interest in supply management?" "It's my job to understand what we have on hand," she said. "How else do I order what we need?" "We have a procurement department for that," Whitfield said. He was smiling now, the smile of someone who enjoyed the process of identifying and neutralizing threats. "Your job is to administer medications and monitor patients. Not to second-guess the hospital's purchasing decisions." "Understood, Dr. Whitfield," she said. She returned her attention to the shelves, dismissing him. Her hands were steady as stone. No tremor. No hesitation. Just hands that had done something other than nursing, hands that had learned a different kind of precision in places he could not quite imagine. "Good," he said, and he turned to leave. In the doorway, he paused. "By the way, we're going to be running some background verification on all our new staff. Nothing personal. Just protocol." He watched her for any reaction, a tightness in the jaw, a catch in her breathing, anything that would suggest she had something to hide. But she simply nodded without looking up, and he left her there among the sterile equipment and the humming fluorescent lights, filing away the moment for later consideration, the way he filed away all the small moments that might eventually become useful. Danielle waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway before she allowed her breathing to deepen. Her hands remained steady on the shelf in front of her. The trembling, when it came, waited for her break, waited for her to be alone in the supply closet with the door closed and the darkness around her like an old friend. She pulled the challenge coin from its pocket and held it without turning it over this time, just held it, letting the weight of it ground her to the present moment. 20 years of building this life. 20 years of invisible. And now, in the space of 3 minutes, her careful architecture had been noticed by the one person in the hospital who actually mattered. The cafeteria at St. Michael's smelled like industrial bleach mixed with something vaguely chicken-adjacent, fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional beige that made food look like a prop from a medical school training video. Danielle sat at a corner table on her third day, a turkey sandwich in front of her that she wasn't eating, watching the organized chaos of the morning shift change, nurses rotating out, day staff rotating in, the rhythm of a hospital that never actually stopped, just changed tempo. Dr. Marcus Whitfield stood at the physician's table near the windows, 2 surgical residents flanking him like apostles waiting for doctrine. His voice carried across the cafeteria with the kind of volume that comes from a man who has never once considered that other people might not want to hear him. $20, he said, loud enough that heads turned. $20 as the mouse quits before the week is out. She's got that look. Nervous. Jumpy. Probably cries in the bathroom between rounds. The residents laughed with the particular discomfort of people who wanted to climb the ladder and understood that laughter was the price of entry. Danielle didn't look up from her sandwich. Her jaw tightened, just once, barely visible, the kind of micro-expression that most people would miss. The kind of expression a person makes when they're watching something they already knew was coming. Whitfield stood. Stretched. Began walking toward the coffee station, and the path to that coffee station took him directly past Danielle's table. He was close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive, something that cost more than her weekly rent, when his elbow connected with her lunch tray. Not an accident. The angle was too precise, the timing too deliberate. A man doesn't walk past a table for 3 steps and then collide with it unless he's designed the collision. The tray went airborne. The sandwich tumbled. The apple rolled across the tile. Applesauce scattered like blood spatter across white floor in a geometric spray pattern. 30 staff members watched. The cafeteria didn't go silent so much as it held its breath, the way a room does when someone has just crossed a line and everyone is waiting to see if there will be consequences. Whitfield dropped a patient chart at her feet. Paper scattered across the spilled food. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she would hear the full weight of it, but loud enough that everyone in the cafeteria could hear him speak. "And when you're done playing janitor, these medication logs need filing. Try not to hyperventilate over the responsibility." He smiled at the residents as he walked past them toward the coffee maker. One of them actually laughed, a tight sound like a dog's bark. Danielle knelt. Her hands were perfectly steady. That was the thing, they didn't shake, didn't fumble, didn't betray anything. She gathered the papers first, stacking them with mechanical precision despite the applesauce smeared across one corner, despite the way her jaw was locked tight enough to crack a tooth. Her face was a mask. The same mask she'd worn 20 years ago in Fallujah when a mortar round had bracketed a residential compound on Jolan Street and she'd found a bleeding 8-year-old girl, couldn't have weighed more than 40 pounds, with shrapnel embedded in her small intestine and her mother screaming in Arabic and English simultaneously. Danielle had carried that girl through a firefight. Had kept her airway open. Had moved through the streets of a city that was actively trying to kill her because a child was bleeding out and the medic tent was 3 blocks away and nothing else mattered. She'd never learned the girl's name. Never knew if she'd lived. The girl's face had never left her. The applesauce went into her palm. The sandwich. The apple. She stood with the destroyed lunch balanced in her cupped hands, paper chart stacked on top, dripping slightly. Around her, the cafeteria had resumed its surface activity, but the silence underneath was the kind that comes from collective embarrassment on someone else's behalf. "I need some Jell-O," Danielle said quietly, to no one in particular, to herself really, and she walked to the disposal bin near the kitchen and threw everything away. The chart she placed on the counter. She washed her hands in the employee bathroom sink, water hot enough to turn her skin red, soap applied with the kind of attention someone gives to ritual, and she didn't look in the mirror. She never looked in mirrors. Mirrors showed things she wasn't ready to see. The supply closet on the third floor was her sanctuary on nights like this, on days like this, on the mornings when she came in to find that someone had moved the surgical packs or miscounted the 22-gauge needles. It was a walk-in space, industrial shelving on 3 walls, boxes labeled with the precision of someone who understood that order was the only thing standing between chaos and catastrophe. She sat on the lowest shelf, her back against cold metal, and pulled the challenge coin from her pocket. It was tarnished, the silver oxidized to the color of gunmetal, the edges worn smooth from 2 decades of being held exactly like this. On one side, the Navy insignia. On the other, a date, 2004. Below that, scratched into the surface by shrapnel or a knife point or maybe someone's fingernail during a moment when the fighting was too close and there was nothing else to do but mark something permanent, the call sign, Nightingale. She pressed it into her palm until it left an imprint, a small half-moon indent in her skin that would fade in minutes. Her hands had stopped trembling 3 minutes ago. She'd trained them to stop trembling. She'd trained herself to stop doing a lot of things. Stop flinching. Stop remembering the girl's face. Stop expecting that people like Whitfield would be anything other than exactly what they were. The coin went back into her pocket. She stayed in the supply closet until her shift coordinator called looking for her. At 2 a.m., the code red alarm screamed through St. Michael's ICU like something alive and furious. Danielle was 2 doors down from the emergency, restocking 22-gauge angiocath needles in the supply station, when she heard it. The alarm itself was a sound like nothing else in a hospital, not the steady beep of a monitor, not the hiss of a ventilator, but an acute wail that meant someone's heart had decided to stop negotiating with the rest of their body. She moved. Her feet barely touched the ground, muscle memory taking over the way it does when a body has learned to run toward chaos instead of away from it. ICU Bay 7. The monitor showed a flat line, that particular straight line that looks almost peaceful until you understand that it means death is arriving on schedule. A woman on the bed, younger than Danielle expected, navy tattoo visible on her shoulder where the gown had slipped. The attending physician was Dr. Patel, competent but not decisive, his hands already shaking as he pressed his palms against the patient's chest for CPR compressions. 1, 2, 3. The compressions weren't working. The defibrillator pads were already in place. 2 shocks. Nothing. The heart monitor remained a flat, accusatory line. "We need to call Dr. Whitfield," Patel said, reaching for the phone with his free hand. Danielle was already moving. She grabbed the patient's chart. Captain Sarah Chen. 28 years old. Navy. Post-op from a routine gallbladder removal. The vital sign showed the progression, stable at 8 p.m. when she was transferred to recovery, declining at 10, critical at 1:16 a.m., flatline at 2:03. Something had ruptured internally. Something catastrophic. Something that CPR alone would not fix. "She needs direct cardiac massage," Danielle said. Her voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that carried weight because it wasn't accompanied by emotion. Patel stared at her. "That requires opening the chest. We need Whitfield. She'll be dead in 4 minutes." The heart monitor's flat tone filled the silence like a metronome counting down to a conclusion. Danielle could see the math in Patel's face, the calculation of protocol versus urgency, the weight of hierarchy versus the math of mortality. She'd made that calculation before. In Fallujah. In the medic tent. In the recovery ward at Walter Reed. In every moment when someone needed to be saved and the people in charge were still thinking about chain of command. Her hand moved toward the surgical instrument tray. Patel's eyes went wide. "What are you doing?" he said. Danielle didn't answer. She was already scrubbed in, already moving with the precision of someone who had performed emergency thoracotomy procedures in conditions where there was no attending surgeon, no backup, no option except to open the chest wall and massage a heart directly because the alternative was standing there watching someone die. She was moving like she had muscle memory for this exact moment, for this exact patient, for the Navy captain who somehow had a face that Danielle almost recognized. The sterile field was prepared. The scalpel was in her hand. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook when it mattered. "Get me a 4.0 suture and a satin sky clamp," she said, and Dr. Patel, still frozen, still trying to understand how the quiet supply nurse had become someone who gave orders, reached for the instrument tray. Danielle made the incision, left anterolateral thoracotomy, between the ribs, through the fascia, into the pericardium. The blood was warm. The heart was small, perfect, and completely still. Her fingers found it. Wrapped around it. Began the massage, direct, mechanical, keeping blood flowing to the brain while the defibrillator pads tried again to remind the cardiac tissue that it had a job to do. Around her, the ICU had gone absolutely silent. 3 nurses had arrived. 2 residents. All of them watching a woman in scrubs who looked like she'd been restocking supplies 15 minutes ago, who still had a lunch tray stain on her sleeve, pump a human heart directly in her cupped palms while the monitor traced the rhythm of her compressions and nothing else. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what would change everything. That was what everyone would remember when they looked back at this moment, but it wasn't the thing that had already been written down in Whitfield's phone, recorded in 3 conversations that were already happening. 3 phone calls. 1 to a board member who owed favors. 1 to an investigator on retainer. 1 to a file in the Pentagon marked classified, a file that should have been deleted 20 years ago but never quite was, a file with a name in it that was supposed to have ceased to exist. Danielle felt the heart flutter under her fingers. Once. Twice. The monitor spiked. Sinus rhythm. The heart had remembered how to beat. "We need to close," she said, her voice still steady, still quiet, still the voice of someone who had already survived the worst that the world could do. "And we need to get her to surgery before she bleeds out." Dr. Patel's face had gone white. Behind him, through the ICU window, Danielle could see Whitfield standing in the doorway. He was watching her the way a man watches someone who has just made a very serious mistake. The code red alarm screamed through St. Michael's ICU at 2:07 a.m. like a siren that wouldn't stop breathing. Captain Sarah Chen's monitor flatlined 30 seconds after her post-surgical heart simply decided to quit. No warning, no gradual decline, just a sudden betrayal of tissue and electrical impulse that sent the night shift nurses scrambling. Danielle was standing against the supply wall when it happened, checking inventory logs with the precision of someone who counted things for a living, and she heard the monitors wail before she heard the voices. She didn't move. Not yet. Around her, the ICU erupted in controlled chaos, the kind of chaos that looks random to civilians but follows an ancient protocol written in blood and muscle memory. A resident's hand shook as she reached for the crash cart. A nurse called it in, cardiac arrest, post-op, room 412, need attending stat. The intercom crackled, then the hospital operator's voice, "Dr. Whitfield, your emergency page. Code blue, ICU, room for 12. Dr. Marcus Whitfield arrived 15 minutes later, still wearing the tailored blazer from dinner at LaCroix, his salt and pepper hair immaculate, his expression arranged into the careful concern that won hospital board meetings. He swept into the ICU like a man accustomed to rooms parting for him, and they did. The 2 other attending surgeons, a cardiologist named Patterson and an older trauma surgeon named Chen who shared no relation to the captain, stepped back slightly, giving Whitfield the center position, the authority position, the one that looked best during the inevitable peer review. "How long?" Whitfield demanded, already scanning the monitors. "For minutes down," Patterson said. "We've pushed 1 round of epi. 2 rounds of defibrillation. No response." Whitfield nodded with the certainty of a man who had performed this particular choreography 200 times. He was good at codes. Danielle had seen that much. Competent hands, clear orders, the kind of surgeon who didn't panic when things deteriorated. He was also the kind who would let a patient die rather than let an underling overshadow him. Danielle knew the type. She'd served under men exactly like him in desert compounds and forward operating bases where hierarchy mattered more than breathing. "Another round of defibrillation," Whitfield commanded. "Then push 2 of epi." A nurse leaned over Captain Chen's chest with the defibrillator pads. "Clear." The body jolted. The monitor remained a flat, accusing line. 5 minutes and 30 seconds. 6 minutes. The smell in the room had changed, sweat mixing with antiseptic, the metallic copper tang of blood from the surgical incision, the sharp ozone scent that lingered after defibrillation burned through air. Danielle could smell all of it from her position against the wall, where she'd been pushed by arriving staff, where she stood with her hands flat against the cold tile behind her. Not moving. Not volunteering. Not drawing attention. Invisibility was survival. Invisibility had kept her alive in Fallujah. It would keep her breathing here. Whitfield ordered a third round. Then a fourth. His movements remained precise, but something had shifted in his posture, a tightening around the shoulders, the microscopic sag that came with the recognition that sometimes, despite everything, the body simply quit. Danielle watched his right hand drift toward the monitor, watched his jaw set in the expression that meant he was about to call time of death, watched the exact moment when his authority would transform Captain Chen from patient to case study to loss documented in the permanent record. 7 minutes and 14 seconds. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above them. A ventilator hissed. The monitor's flat line became a sound rather than a visual, a tone that suggested infinity, that suggested the work was finished, that suggested they had all been standing here long enough. Whitfield's mouth opened. Danielle's legs moved before her brain caught up with the choice they were making. She didn't ask permission. Permission was for people who had time to ask. Her hands reached for the surgical kit, the thoracotomy tray with the giggly saw and the rib spreader and the clamps that hung like instruments from a darker century. Direct cardiac massage, she said, and her voice came out different than it had in the cafeteria, different than it had all week. Now. Whitfield spun toward her with the velocity of a man whose authority had just been questioned in front of witnesses. Get out of this room before I have you, but Danielle had already opened Captain Chen's chest. The incision was clean. Fast. Practiced. The kind of incision that came from having done it in a medical tent with mortars falling outside, with blood mixing with sand, with an 8-year-old girl bleeding out from shrapnel wounds while rounds snapped overhead, and the option to ask permission was a luxury that didn't exist. She cracked the ribs with the spreader, the sound like wood splitting, and her hands moved inside the cavity with the fluid precision of someone who'd held hearts before. Of someone who'd held them and felt them restart beneath her palms. Direct cardiac massage. Palm against the muscle. Compressions at a steady rhythm, feeling for the response, listening to the body's language underneath her hands. Her thumbs found the aorta. 30 seconds. 45. The monitor remained flat. Whitfield had gone completely silent. He stood in the doorway like he'd been carved there, his eyes narrowed down to something that looked like recognition mixed with fury, watching this night shift nurse perform a procedure most surgeons never mastered, watching her hands move inside a human chest cavity with the certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose. 90 seconds. The monitor blipped. Once. Then again. Then the rhythm came back like a light switching on, the monitor showed sinus rhythm, the heart had restarted, and Captain Sarah Chen's blood pressure began climbing from the dead zone back into the land of the living. 70/40, a resident whispered. Climbing. 80/50. BP stabilizing. The room exhaled like it had been holding its breath for a century. Danielle stepped back, her hands red with blood and the residue of someone else's mortality, her face expressionless, her voice flat as she handed the instruments to the surgical nurse. She needs ICU monitoring. Watch for arrhythmias. Not a request. Not a suggestion. An order delivered with the weight of someone who had seen the consequences of not following them. She walked out of the room without waiting for Whitfield's response, without making eye contact, without doing any of the small submissive things that kept the peace in hospital hierarchies. Her scrubs were blood-soaked. Her hands were still steady. And Whitfield stood in the doorway watching her go, his jaw so tight it looked like bone trying to escape skin, his eyes tracking her down the hallway with the calculation of a man who had just understood that he'd made the most serious miscalculation of his career. He had no idea who. he was standing next to, but he was beginning to suspect that whatever she was, whatever she'd been, it was far worse than a threat to his embezzlement schemes. It was something that could unravel every carefully maintained lie he'd constructed. And that realization, that look in his eyes as she disappeared into the hallway, was the moment everything changed. That was the moment Danielle Ross stopped being invisible. But neither of them knew what that invisibility breaking would cost. By morning, Dr. Marcus Whitfield had already made 3 phone calls from his office, each one a calculated move to eliminate the threat sleeping in a basement apartment across the city. The first call went to Gerald Hutchins, a board member who owed Whitfield favors stretching back 6 years, preferential surgical referrals that had padded Hutchins' private practice with an extra $800,000 in annual revenue. The phone rang twice before Hutchins answered, his voice warm with the false familiarity of men who had traded integrity for comfort long ago. "Marcus, what can I do for you?" Whitfield's tone was casual, almost friendly, but his knuckles were white against the desk. "I need you to look into something. The new night shift nurse, Danielle Ross. I think she's falsified her credentials." He let that sit for a moment. Military service records don't match her application. Could be a security issue. Could be worse. Hutchins made a small noise of concern, the sound of a man remembering that he owed this particular doctor more than professional courtesy. "I'll make a call. What are we looking for?" Whitfield smiled. "Anything that doesn't fit. I'll handle the rest." The second call came at 7:30, routed directly to the Naval Personnel Records Office in Washington through a contact who still picked up when Whitfield called, a retired lieutenant commander who worked in records management and who had learned 15 years ago that access to classified databases was a form of currency. "I need a background verification on a Master Chief." Whitfield paused, the rank name tasting wrong in his mouth, like biting down on something harder than expected. "On Danielle Ross. Navy service. Cross-reference against her hospital employment application from September. Look for discrepancies." The lieutenant commander put him on hold. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed like something mechanical struggling to breathe. When the line crackled back to life, the voice had changed, become official in a way that made even Whitfield sit straighter. "Dr. Whitfield, those records are flagged as classified. I'll need authorization from your department head and legal counsel to proceed. Also, any unauthorized access request gets logged and forwarded to NCIS. Are you sure you want to file this inquiry?" Whitfield hung up. He sat very still in his chair, his pulse climbing, before dialing the third number. Marcus Levi picked up on the first ring. He always did. 30 years of private investigation work had taught him that immediate response was often the difference between getting a job and being called by someone else, and Whitfield had been Levy's most reliable client for the past decade, steady retainer, no moral complications, and payment in cash. "I need a credentials audit," Whitfield said without preamble. "New employee. Danielle Ross. Night shift nurse, started 2 weeks ago. Military background is messy, gaps in employment history, classification flags. I need something that proves she lied on her application." Levi was already writing. Timeline. 48 hours. I need her gone before the next budget review. Consider it done. The line went dead. Whitfield sat in his office as the morning light crept across the desk, its pale fingers revealing dust on the framed diploma from Johns Hopkins, and he allowed himself a single moment of satisfaction. The mouse was finished. Danielle Ross didn't know it yet, but the machinery was already in motion, a machinery built from favor trading and classified access requests and a private investigator who had learned long ago that military records are surprisingly easy to manipulate if you know which files were supposed to be erased and which ones survived by accident. Whitfield knew about erased records. It was the leverage that kept certain admirals cooperative. Now he would use that knowledge against the one person in his hospital who had made him feel, for the first time in his career, genuinely threatened. The escort came on day 2, delivered by hospital security in the form of 2 men in navy blazers who appeared at 7 in the morning while Danielle was restocking the medication room. The supervisor, a woman named Sarah Chen with kind eyes and a spine made of jello, stood in the doorway looking at her shoes. "Ms. Ross, we need you to collect your personal belongings. Your employment has been terminated effective immediately." Eleanor still wouldn't look up. "The reason," Danielle's voice was ice, steady as a surgical clamp, "is falsified credentials. Your military service records don't match your application. That constitutes fraud, and St. Michael's takes that very seriously." Eleanor had been instructed to read from the termination letter. She did it badly, stumbling over the legalese that Whitfield's office had carefully assembled. Danielle set down the medication vials she'd been holding with the same precision she'd used to hold Sarah Chen's heart muscle 2 nights ago. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw clenched once, almost invisibly, but her face remained a perfect mask, the same face she'd worn in Fallujah when she'd identified the bodies of 3 Marines who'd been with her since Kandahar, the same composure that had gotten her through 20 years of things that couldn't be spoken about afterward. She nodded once. "I'll get my things." The walk through the hallway felt longer than the actual distance measured in floor tiles. 17 hallway sections, she counted them, each one bringing her past nurses who had started to trust her, past residents who had seen her do things no night shift nurse should be able to do, past the ICU where Sarah Chen was still healing in a room just beyond the glass. Nobody met her eyes. Their silence was the sound of institutional self-preservation, everyone recognizing that standing too close to someone being escorted out was a career risk. The box they gave her was white and generic, the kind that shipped office supplies from Amazon. She filled it with her personal effects, a spare uniform, the photograph of her unit from Camp Lejeune, the tarnished military challenge coin she kept in her locker, a pair of reading glasses she'd never actually used. The coin caught the light as she placed it inside, a dull glint of metal that had survived things that shouldn't be survivable. Dr. Whitfield emerged from his office as she passed, appearing with timing that felt choreographed, a folder in his hands, triumph in the way he stood. "Your records didn't match, Ms. Ross. Military service documentation shows gaps that don't align with your application timeline. We take fraud very seriously." He said it loud enough for people passing through the administrative wing to hear, loud enough to establish the official narrative. She was a liar, a security risk, someone who'd tried to slip into the hospital on false credentials. What Whitfield didn't mention, because he couldn't afford to mention it, was that the gaps existed because Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had spent 7 years in a capacity that the Pentagon required to be officially erased, a black ops extraction team that pulled people out of places that technically didn't exist, from a Fallujah safe house in 2004 when an American asset was about to be executed. That extraction, and her role in it, had been so deeply compartmentalized that even her basic file had been redacted, classified, deliberately fragmented into pieces that couldn't be connected unless you had the security clearance to do so. Whitfield's investigator had found those fragments and woven them into contradiction, a Master Chief's rank designation in one database, no rank at all in another, service records showing her at Camp Lejeune in 2005, other records showing her in a place her government would never admit existed. The contradiction was perfect. It was also damning. She carried the box to the parking garage, her footsteps echoing in the concrete vault that smelled of diesel exhaust and the residual oil of 10,000 commutes. The security guard who'd checked her in her first day didn't acknowledge her departure. Nobody escorted her to her car, they just let her walk, and the walk was its own kind of exile. When she reached the vehicle, a 10-year-old Honda with one tire that always ran slightly low, she placed the box on the passenger seat and sat in the driver's seat with the door open, her feet still on the concrete. The engine stayed off. The key stayed in her pocket. For 40 minutes, Danielle Ross sat with her forehead pressed against the steering wheel, unable to move, unable to start the car, unable to do anything but exist in the space between the life she'd built in invisibility and the complete erasure she felt happening in real time. The challenge coin had fallen from the box onto the floor mat, rolling slightly to rest against the door sill. She stared at it without picking it up, the tarnished metal catching the fluorescent light of the parking garage, the image on its face worn almost smooth from 20 years of hands holding it in moments like this. Around her, the garage was silent except for the occasional drip of water from a pipe somewhere above, each drop hitting concrete with a sound like a tiny bell marking time. She couldn't remember why she'd survived Fallujah. She couldn't remember why she'd survived the extraction. She couldn't remember why her fingers had known exactly where to cut into Sarah Chen's chest, why her hands had moved with the precision of someone who'd done this 100 times before, why she'd saved the life of a captain who'd been an 8-year-old girl hiding under debris when Danielle had found her. She sat in the silent car and pressed her forehead harder against the steering wheel, and for the first time in 20 years, she let herself wonder if surviving had ever been the right choice. The first indication that something had shifted came at 6 a.m. the next morning, when the parking lot outside St. Michael's began to fill with vehicles that didn't belong to hospital staff. Black Suburbans with tinted windows. A military sedan with government plates. The quiet rotation of red and blue lights that had been ordered dark, no siren, no announcement, just a silent arrival in the pre-dawn darkness that made the early morning staff stop their cars and watch. Something was coming, everyone could feel it, the way animals feel weather change in the pressure of the air itself. 3 hums rolled into the St. Michael's Circular Drive at 6:22 a.m., tires hissing on the wet asphalt from the overnight rain, their paint still dark with diesel exhaust and the particular mud of a military motor pool. The vehicles didn't announce themselves. No sirens. No lights. Just the deliberate arrival of people accustomed to moving through the world as if it would arrange itself to accommodate them. The early shift staff, nurses arriving with travel mugs of coffee, residents coming off overnight call with hollow eyes, stopped their cars and watched. Something in the pressure of the air had changed. The commander stepped out first. His uniform pressed so sharp it could cut, his ribbon stacked 3 rows deep, his bearing the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world could offer. He moved through the automatic doors of St. Michael's without acknowledging the front desk, without the hesitation civilians brought to hospitals. His boots on the tile floor sounded like a metronome, like institutional authority finding its rhythm in a place where doctors still thought they made the rules. The elderly security guard, a Marine Corps veteran with 32 years of service in his posture, recognized the insignia. He set down his coffee with the precision of someone standing at attention without actually standing. The commander's voice was quiet but absolute. "I'm looking for Chief Nightingale." The room didn't freeze so much as realize it should have been paying attention all along. The security guard's jaw tightened. "Master Chief Petty Officer Ross is no longer employed here, sir. She was terminated yesterday. For credential falsification." The commander's eyes didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't do anything except catalog this information like it was being filed directly into a system that would remember it forever. "Is that so?" It wasn't a question. The morning shift supervisor emerged from her office, sensing the texture of the air had changed in a way that required administrative presence. Behind her came Dr. Whitfield, still in yesterday's wrinkled shirt, drawn by the same instinct that makes predators look up when they hear a helicopter. His face was the color of hospital walls, institutional beige with a slight gray undertone that suggested his sleep had been the kind where nightmares didn't feel different from consciousness. The elevator doors slid open with their hydraulic exhale, and Captain Sarah Chen stepped into the lobby in a hospital gown, the surgical tape across her sternum visible where the gown gaped, her movements careful but deliberate. She disconnected herself from the four-pole 8 minutes ago and ignored the floor nurse's protests. Some things were more important than protocol. When she saw the assembled crowd, the commander, the security guard, the hospital administrator appearing from her office like a character summoned by stage direction, her small smile appeared and held. "That woman saved my life twice," Captain Chen said. Her voice wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. "Once in Fallujah when I was 8 years old and my village was shelled. I don't remember much except hands. Steady hands that carried me to the medic tent while everything around us was fire." Chen paused. Looked directly at Whitfield. "And 3 nights ago when my heart stopped and she cut me open with battlefield precision because she was the only one in this hospital who knew what she was doing." The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their fluorescent song. The commander turned to Whitfield. Not as a physician. Not with any deference to the white coat that hung on his body like a borrowed costume. He turned to him the way superior officers turn to explain military law to people who have forgotten they are civilians. Your investigation into Master Chief Ross's credentials, the commander said, triggered an automatic audit of your departmental finances. He paused. Let that settle. The FBI is very interested in discussing $17 million in fraudulent billing. Whitfield's face didn't drain of color so much as the color drained him, as if every red blood cell had received simultaneous orders to abandon ship. The security guard, that Marine Corps veteran who had seen enough of institutional collapse to recognize the architecture of it, stood up. It wasn't dramatic. Just the simple gesture of standing, of bearing witness, of making clear that he had heard every word and his memory would not fade. By noon, federal agents arrived at St. Michael's with boxes and the particular silence of people executing a search warrant that felt like justice being alphabetized. By 2 p.m., Dr. Whitfield's office was sealed with the same yellow tape that marked crime scenes, and his career had transitioned from active physician to pending criminal defendant faster than a code blue call could be answered. The investigator Whitfield had hired, Marcus Levi, the man who had manufactured Danielle's false credentials, cooperated immediately with federal agents. Not out of loyalty. Out of the same survival instinct that makes rats board the sinking ship in reverse, fleeing toward solid ground. Levi provided documentation of every record Whitfield had asked him to falsify, every vendor kickback, every inflated equipment cost that had been billed to Medicare and Medicaid and private insurance companies whose lawyers were already preparing their response. The board member Whitfield had called for favors, Gerald Hutchins, became a witness when his own surgical referral payments came under scrutiny. His consulting contracts vanished. His credibility, constructed over 17 years, collapsed like a building with its foundation removed. By Friday, Dr. Marcus Whitfield stood in an empty office while security personnel removed his belongings into a banker's box. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. His trial was set. The residents who had laughed at his cafeteria joke about the mouse wouldn't return his calls anymore. His ex-wife had already texted a single emoji, a smiling face with closed eyes, before blocking his number. Meanwhile, in an office on the 3rd floor, the hospital board chair signed a formal letter reinstating Danielle Ross with full back pay and a profound apology that acknowledged nothing specific because everything specific would have generated litigation. The letter was placed in a manila envelope and left at the security desk because Danielle had already made clear she wouldn't be returning for any in-person meetings. She had already filed her resignation. Already accepted a position at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center across the city. Already understood that St. Michael's was a place she had saved lives in while invisible, and she had no interest in becoming visible to people who would never have valued what they were watching. But Captain Sarah Chen had asked to see her before she left. They met in a private room where the machines had been silenced and the only sound was the Philadelphia traffic for stories below. Sarah Chen, still in a hospital gown, still moving like her surgical tape might split open if she turned too quickly, pressed something into Danielle's palm. A challenge coin. Tarnished from 20 years of being carried in a uniform pocket. Worn smooth from fingers that had held it through desert storms and medical school applications and promotions and losses that statistics couldn't measure. My father carried this the day you saved me, Captain Chen said. Gave it to me when I made captain. Said someday I'd understand what it meant. That some people spend their whole lives being invisible so the people around them can see clearly. Chen paused. Let her hand rest on Danielle's for exactly 1 second. I understand now. Danielle's hand closed around the coin. For the first time in 20 years, since Fallujah, since the erasure, since the challenge coin had become the only proof that her life before 2010 had actually existed, her breathing steadied into something that felt almost like peace. 6 months later, she walked past a strip mall near St. Michael's on a Saturday afternoon, moving between her car and the Veterans Affairs Clinic where her nameplate read D. Ross, RN, with no rank listed, no history attached, no invisible weight. She glanced through a storefront window and saw Dr. Marcus Whitfield sitting at a folding table with insurance brochures spread before him like the cards of a collapsed fortune teller. His medical license was framed and hanging in a lawyer's office, evidence for the trial. His name appeared in legal documents and payment plans and bankruptcy forms. He was explaining Medicare supplement options to an elderly couple who looked skeptical. He glanced up as she passed, but there was no recognition in his eyes. She was just another person on the sidewalk. Invisible. Danielle didn't break stride. Her hand moved to her pocket and touched the challenge coin, Sarah Chen's coin, the same one that had sustained her through every humiliation, every quiet night shift, every moment of being underestimated by people who thought invisibility meant absence rather than presence. For the first time in 2 decades, she smiled. Not triumphant. Not bitter. Just the small acknowledgement that sometimes the people who think they're invisible are the ones holding everything together while the loud ones collapse under their own weight. The coin was warm in her pocket. The same warmth it had carried through combat zones and hospital corridors and parking garages where women sat alone learning how to breathe again. She drove to the VA clinic where a young combat medic, 19 years old, 3 tours, night terrors that medication couldn't touch, was sitting in the waiting room with his hands shaking. When he asked her how she stayed so calm, she pulled out the challenge coin and held it where he could see the tarnish and the wear marks and the names barely visible from decades of fingers holding it. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, she said. The medic looked at the coin. Then at her. Then at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. And nodded like he finally understood something he'd been searching for since Kandahar. If there's someone in your life who's been quietly holding everything together, a nurse, a veteran, a person everyone overlooks, take a moment to tell them. Their invisibility doesn't mean they don't matter. Sometimes it means they matter the most. Subscribe for more stories of quiet heroes. Like this video. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to?